Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're undertaking a really critical mission, trying to slice through the headlines of some, well, truly consequential global events.
We're examining how the very foundation of modern international relations.
The principle of state sovereignty.
Exactly. How that bedrock principle is being actively challenged and, I would say, eroded by major world powers.
It really feels like the traditional rules of the game are breaking down. Okay, let's unpack this. We need to understand why. We're comparing 4 flashpoints that I think really define this shift. There's the recent and highly controversial U.S. military operation in Venezuela, then Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
And then we'll look at the terrifying precedents these actions might be setting for future conflicts, thinking specifically about Taiwan and, believe it or not, Greenland.
And what connects all 4 of these scenarios, and this is what you really have to grasp right from the start, is the institutional danger. It's the danger created when great powers start treating borders and political independence as negotiable.
Optional, almost.
Optional, through the use of force. If the UN Charter is applied selectively, if major nations can just decide to breach it when it suits their interests, then the Charter essentially becomes optional for everyone. That collapse is the fundamental threat here.
So to really understand that threat, we need to know what the rules are in the first place.
Right. We have to establish the international law baseline. It's all there in the UN Charter, specifically Article 2, Paragraph 4. This is the cornerstone. I mean, it is the absolute cornerstone of the entire post-1945 system.
And what does it say?
It requires all member states to absolutely refrain from the threat or use of force against the, quote, territorial integrity or political independence of any state. It's an almost total prohibition.
Almost total. But we see military action every year, so there must be exceptions, right? What are the accepted legal pathways around that?
There are, but, and this is the key, they're extremely narrow and very strict. Generally speaking, there are only 3 recognized legal avenues.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have explicit authorization from the UN Security Council under Chapter 7. Think of the coalition authorized a deal with the invasion of Kuwait back in 1990.
Right.
Second, you have a valid act of self-defense under Article 51. But that requires an actual armed attack to have happened, and the response has to be necessary and strictly proportional.
And the third?
The third and the simplest is just consent, the genuine, uncoerced consent of the territorial state's government.
So anything outside of those 3 is questionable.
It's heavily disputed or, in many cases, outright illegal. Things like humanitarian intervention without a UN mandate. Very murky legal ground.
That sets the stage beautifully for our first flashpoint then. The U.S. intervention in Venezuela, Operation Absolute Resolve, which happened on January 3rd, 2026. The sources show this was a large-scale, coordinated military effort. We're talking over 150 aircraft, strikes on various bits of infrastructure, and the final outcome was
the capture and transfer of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife.
Right, to the U.S. to face criminal charges in New York.
And the initial framing by U.S. officials was, it's all about law enforcement. It was about narcotics trafficking and these existing criminal indictments.
But that story changed almost immediately.
It broadened instantly into something far more legally problematic.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. That initial rationale, law enforcement, was immediately paired with public statements from officials about temporarily running Venezuela during a transition.
And the big one.
And, crucially, making sure they could get the oil flowing again. That combination just pushes the whole thing beyond any narrow law enforcement idea and into territory that looks a lot more like
regime change.
Regime change, occupation, and resource control.
And that combination is precisely why legal experts see this as a probable, if not definitive, violation of Article 2.4.
The legal orthodoxies are just so clear on this.
A state's criminal jurisdiction over an individual, even a head of state, does not suddenly grant it the right to conduct military operations inside another sovereign state. I mean, if that were the case, the international system would just collapse overnight.
Because every country could just invade another based on a domestic warrant.
Exactly. So the legal defense for this seems to lean entirely on a new assertion of unilateral power.
A new doctrine, almost.
It is. Some analysts have already started calling it the Donroe Doctrine, this idea of an exclusive sphere of influence in the Americas that effectively, well, it supersedes the universal constraints of the UN Charter.
So it's saying that in Washington's backyard, the rules are different.
That's the argument, that if a regime in that sphere threatens U.S. interests, be it security, drug flow, resource access, then Washington claims a right to override that state's sovereignty with force.
Now, what's so fascinating here and so troubling is that we can take that action in Venezuela and place it right next to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yes. And to be clear, we are not equating the scale or the specific pretexts. We are analyzing the structural damage to international law.
Let me just make sure I'm following. Are we saying that using force, even if it's framed as something good, like anti-narcotics enforcement, can functionally create the same institutional harm as an overt war of aggression?
Precisely. That is the core point. The first similarity is that immediate, fundamental disregard for sovereignty. Russia's invasion is, well, it's the textbook violation of Article 2.4. Everyone agrees on that.
The paradigm case.
It is. But the U.S. action, a military raid to seize a sitting head of state and then openly talking about running the country, that collides head-on with the exact same sovereignty-first architecture. In both cases, a major power is asserting a right to use military force inside another state's borders to get the political outcome they want.
Which brings us to the logic of regime change.
It does. The stated motivations are totally different, of course. Russia uses security narratives, protecting Russian speakers, and so on. The U.S. uses criminal prosecution and anti-narcotics aims. But the operational result?
It's comparable.
It is. Both actions use military force to override the political independence of another state.
So it doesn't matter if the pretext is national security or international criminal justice. The outcome is using military force to decide who gets to govern an independent country.
Which directly violates the promise of political independence in the Charter. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, well, we can't ignore the resources.
Right.
Russia's war in Ukraine has undeniable economic dimensions. We're talking grain, mineral wealth, energy control.
And in the Venezuela case, the U.S. officials weren't shy about it. The public references to getting the oil flowing, you can't just ignore that.
You can't. Venezuela holds something like 20% of global oil reserves. When resource control becomes a public part of the rationale for an intervention, it just validates the most cynical interpretation that this is about coercion in economics.
And the real danger here, what our sources keep pointing to, is the collapse of credibility, the rule of law credibility. When the U.S., the country that championed this whole rules-based order, appears to just bypass the Charter.
It hands rival powers a devastatingly effective talking point.
You did it, so why can't we?
Exactly. When Washington asserts that its domestic criminal interests grant it military prerogative inside Venezuela, it functionally greenlights Beijing to assert that its domestic interest in reunification grants it military prerogative inside Taiwan.
The ability to apply any kind of global pressure just collapses.
It collapses instantly. Which brings us to the future and how this Venezuela precedent, paired with Russia's actions, could impact these looming flashpoints. Let's start with Taiwan.
Okay.
Taiwan's status is, of course, legally very complex. China consistently says it's part of the PRC. But any action by a major power that weakens the global norm against using force to settle political disputes, well, that's immensely helpful to Beijing's narrative.
And we're already seeing reports that Beijing is adapting its rhetoric, right? How are they leveraging the Venezuela operation?
They're essentially arguing for equivalence. They're suggesting that if the U.S. can unilaterally use force to process, as they say, a foreign leader for its own domestic interests and to secure resources,
then China is just as justified in using force for its core domestic goal reunification and, not coincidentally, securing the critical semiconductor industry.
Precisely. The normalization of unilateral regime change just lowers the diplomatic and military threshold for China to launch its own operation. Beijing's calculus shifts from, will the world condemn us for breaking the rules, to
the rules are already broken, will the world resist us with pure power?
And that is a terrifying psychological shift.
That shift from legal risk to a pure power calculation. That leads us straight to the Greenland scenario, which is moving from a contested status like Taiwan to potential resource-driven annexation.
This is the ultimate test of the Charter's prohibition on acquiring territory by force.
What's the context here?
Well, after the shock of the Venezuela operation, the Danish and Greenlandic prime ministers publicly rejected any U.S. overtures about acquisition. The U.S. response was to introduce the Make Greenland Great Again Act.
And that framed Greenland's vast mineral wealth and its strategic Arctic position
as vital, as essential to U.S. national security.
So that rhetoric, linking strategic necessity and resource security, is setting the stage for what you called resource-driven annexation. What is the legal reality here? Is it ambiguous at all?
No. Legally, it's black and white, totally unlike Taiwan. Greenland is a constituent part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is an original UN member state and a core NATO ally. A forced occupation or annexation would be an unambiguous, clear-as-day violation of Article 2.4.
And it would violate that other fundamental rule.
That territorial acquisition through force is illegal and void, period.
So why would that specific act be so catastrophic for something like NATO?
Because it would detonate the alliance's trust instantly. The foundational principle of NATO is collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. If the leading partner in NATO, the U.S., seizes the territory of another core member, Denmark, the entire mutual security framework it evaporates.
It would prove the cynics right.
It would validate the argument rivals have made for decades, that alliances are meaningless and that spheres of influence dictated by raw power have completely replaced international law. It would be the official end of the rules-based order.
So what does this all mean for you, for the listener trying to navigate this new global landscape? The challenge we're facing seems to be the rise of this dynamic where power, not law, dictates action.
Might makes right.
It's returning with a vengeance.
That's the essential synthesis, I think. Russia's invasion of Ukraine remains the most egregious, large-scale case of aggression we've seen against a UN member. But the reported U.S. intervention in Venezuela, especially when its rationale bleeds into governance and resource control, it risks providing a kind of structural cover for the very dynamics we condemn in Moscow.
It normalizes the behavior.
It normalizes the idea that if a superpower feels its security or interests are sufficiently threatened, they can treat the sovereignty of a smaller state as conditional. And this raises an important question, one we all have to consider.
Which is?
If the U.S. position is that criminal justice or national security justifies seizing a sovereign leader by force, why shouldn't that exact same logic be available to China for its claims, or to Russia for its geopolitical aims? That is the slippery precedent the UN Charter was created to prevent.
I think that's the critical takeaway. It doesn't matter if the stated motives are criminal justice, security, or economic gain. When powerful nations choose to bypass these established constraints, they create a global climate where the sovereignty of smaller nations becomes strictly conditional. Their independence is suddenly dependent entirely on the tolerance and the needs of their nearest superpower. So what happens to the rules-based order when the rule makers themselves choose to ignore the rules? We'll leave you with that thought.